Okay, perfect. Thanks so much for the amazing presentation. And well, first of all, I'm going to lower a little bit the bar here of expectations. And the thing is this is going to be a very speculative presentation. It's not based on it. I'm not going to show you results, or I'm not going to show you a very well built research. This is all, I would say, initial stage. Still, everything is in progress. Actually, I still have to do things. Or I still have to start the actual research, I would say. And the second thing, I'm going to talk about ethics a little bit, and I'm going to use approaches and use words that maybe are not so familiar with all of you. So if you have questions, feel free to ask, and I'll try to use terms that are as simple as possible and understandable as possible. What I'll try to do today is to show you that reward mechanisms are normative devices. And I'll come back to this later on, so I will explain you what I mean. Oh, wait a second here. I noticed that my screen is not entirely shared. Wait a second. Now you can see it, I think. Okay, sorry for this interruption. And so I'll try to show you that reward mechanisms are ethical normative devices. And in the end of the presentation, I'll try to include by stating the necessity of a taxonomy of reward mechanisms. So let's start with a very, very broad question, but it's necessary when we talk about ethics. And the question is, first of all, is technology neutral? I know that this is a broad question, and we need to define what we mean by neutrality here. What do we mean by neutral? So here I mean morally neutral. Again, the question is, what do we mean by moral? Here by morality, and by the way, I will use morality, moral, and ethics interchangeably in this presentation, because I give to these two words the same meaning. By morality, I mean a set of principles concerning the distinction between the right, and the wrong, the good and the bad, good and bad behaviors. So principles concerning what's good and what's bad behavior. So let's try to go back to the question that I asked initially. Is technology neutral? Well, let's try to translate it into different terms. Do technologies influence our moral decisions? Do technologies influence our way of viewing or acting in a good or in a bad way? Some of you may think so. Some of you may think that technologies are just tools. That's a common view. That has been a common view for many, many years, many decades, many centuries actually, in the field of ethics. The idea that technologies are just means. The goals are always set by us, by humans. We set the goals, and technologies are just means to realize those goals. So in themselves, from this point of view, technologies are neutral. You might have seen or heard about this slogan. This is the slogan from the National Rifle Association. It says, guns don't kill people, people kill people. It's a slogan that indeed represents this idea, the idea that it's not the thing, it's not the artifact, it's not the technology who has moral values. It's always the human. It's us who decide whether to use it in a good or in a bad way. Even guns in themselves are just tools. They don't have values. It's us who decides how to use them. Now, this view is what is often called the instrumentalist view of technology. Indeed, it's the idea that technologies is just an instrument. It's neutral. It's just a tool. Now, the opposite view is what we call technological determinism. This is the complete, the opposite side of the spectrum, and it says that, no, actually, technology, with a capital letter, is what is always determining the way we think and feel, our values. It is always determining the way we act in our reality, both individually and socially. Now, you might buy into one of these two different views, one or the other one, but generally speaking, over the last few years, what is called soft determinism, a soft deterministic view has become more common, which is the idea that, well, technology is to a certain degree shaping the way we act. Maybe not entirely, maybe not 100%, but technologies, with a plural, are not just instruments. Sometimes they affect the way we act. Sometimes they set goals for us. two big schools in the specific field of philosophy of ethics that stress how technologies are participants, are actually imposing on us some forms of values, are what are called, on the one hand, there is the school of the post-phenomenology. On the other hand, another good example is that of information ethics. These are two schools that indeed stress how technologies participate, have an effect on our moral view of the world. Now, I know that this introduction is going to be a little bit long, but I'm coming. I'm almost there. I'm almost arrived in talking, and I'm going to talk about reward mechanisms soon. Just hang just a little bit more. So here we are at this idea that technologies partially determine how we act and our values. It's the idea that technologies have some values, and these values, generally speaking, are the values that developers, that people who create these technologies are imposing on them. So for example, when I'm building a piece of software, I'm imagining possible audience, I'm imagining possible future users, and my biases are going to filter the way I will build the software, the piece of software that I'm building. So to a certain degree, I'm going to shape the software. I'm going to shape the piece of software based on my assumptions. And those assumptions are going to be built in, ingrained, be part of the software itself. So they have some forms of values. And ultimately, as users, by using these technologies or these artifacts are going to a certain degree, filter the way we see our reality. A good example is that of glasses. This is an old technology, obviously. It's a low-tech technology. But at the same time, we can see how they are filtering the way we see reality. They are not just tools that are external to where we are. So to a certain degree, the division of subject, on the one hand, and object, as two different things, distant one from the other, sometimes collapses. Objects or artifacts, such as glasses, are transforming the way we see reality. Now, over the last few years, some form of paradigm shift, I think, has occurred. Technologies, artifacts are not just tools anymore. We're not just building tools when we say that we build technologies. More and more, we are coming into building world. From tool making, we could say we are building worlds. Games are a good example, I think. Video games are good examples, but software, digital environments in general, it's hard to say that they are just tools. We're not just using a video game. We are often part of that environment. We are moving in that environment. Of course, depending on the level of abstraction that you take, you could see them as tools to get entertained, tools to have fun. But on the other hand, if you take a lower level of abstraction, they're not just tools. They're environments. They're something more. And these are words that have their own rules and laws. So what has this to do with reward mechanisms? Reward mechanisms are structures that give sense to these words that we are creating, to software, to video games, to platforms. They are producing a set of goals. They are giving us a set of goals. And by doing this, they create contextual ideas of what's good and bad within that specific environment. What's good and what's bad. If you remember at the very beginning, we talked about what's morality. And I said the idea of acting principles about what's good and what's bad, principle about what's good behavior and bad behavior. We could say that reward mechanisms are, in this deductive way of thinking, we could say that reward mechanisms are creating, producing ideas, good and bad, are creating normative structures, normative standards within virtual worlds. Now, this is already very important right now, in a time where video games are becoming more and more popular, in a times where different types of digital environments are becoming more and more popular. But in the future, think about the metaverse or the different versions of the metaverse. Think about DAO, blockchain technologies, smart contracts, all these ideas of building small virtual world with their own rules and their own reward mechanisms are going to generate different types of normative standards. Now, a possible issue here, or something that we should be careful of, is that the goals set by reward mechanisms within a specific digital environment might clash with personal and social interests. What I mean here is that the ethics, the contextual ethics of a virtual environment might clash with the contextual ethics of our society, or our personal moral views, or our interests, or our goals. So this is why I do believe that we need to understand the effects and the normative standards that different types of reward mechanisms are producing. And finally, here we are. After this very super long and elaborated introduction, here we are. What are, like, in the end, what are we even talking about? What are these reward mechanisms? Because I haven't defined them yet. Now, if we look at the literature, there are different, in different disciplines, so in the behavioral sciences, in human-computer interaction and design studies, game studies, management and organizational studies, all these different disciplines for years and years have been talking about incentives and rewards in different ways and using different terminologies. Still, we have not a very unified and homogeneous way, a taxonomy, to talk about them. Let's start with reward. What is a reward? Now here I'm building from Schultz. This is a definition that comes from the behavioral sciences. And it's the idea that any stimulus, object, event, activity, or situation that has the potential to make us approach and consume it. Why am I showing you this specific definition? Well, the interesting idea of this is that reward is never about and the inherent qualities of a thing. It's never about the thing in itself. There's no such a thing as a reward. Reward is always something to which we give value, anything to which an actor attributes value, and whose consumption might reinforce a behavior. That is a reward. There's not such a thing as a universal absolute reward. Now, you might think that monetary rewards are absolute and universal forms of rewards, but that is simply because, contextually speaking, they are universally considered valuable. Money is a way of changing, transforming value in itself. And that's why probably they are commonly considered as valuable. But the idea that there is something which is reward, or that reward being a reward is a property of something or thing, that's logically flawed as a way of thinking. It's always something to which we attribute value. Now, the other side of this definition is mechanism. Mechanism, what is a mechanism? Mechanism is a structure performing a function in virtue of its component parts, component operations, and their organizations. But what is important here is that a mechanism is composed by different parts. It has different parts. It's not just the function. And I will come to this a little bit later on. It's the idea that a reward function and a reward mechanism are a little bit different. I'll come to this later. This is a translation in more simple layman terms. Reward is anything valuable given to reinforce a behavior. Mechanism is a structure providing a reward when a set condition is met. Now, reward mechanisms are not reward types. They are both very interesting field of studies, for sure. Studying reward types could be very interesting. Reward mechanisms also consider reward types. Reward types are, or rewards in themselves, are part of a reward mechanism. However, these are two different layers, I would say. Reward mechanisms have, as a component, rewards as well. But it has to be drawn a line to differentiate, to see that these two things are slightly different. Another thing important to notice, reward mechanisms are not reward functions. Reward functions are part of a reward mechanism, or could be part of a reward mechanism. Well, they are part of it. But there is a difference here between these two different things. This is what we would say is a reward function, usually. If X is true, so if a condition of eligibility is true, if is met, then, well, give a reward. That would be the function. The reward mechanism is the ensemble of parts that perform, that operate this function. So in this sense, it also contains the function, but it's not just the function. There's a difference here. Now, where to start studying reward mechanisms? This is a hard question. I would say, from my point of view, there are three different ways, three different pieces of a puzzle that we have to take into consideration. The first one is the different categories of reward mechanism. And if we go back to the idea of mechanism, to the definition of mechanism, and we see mechanism as something that is composed, that has different parts, then to categorize, to create a taxonomy, we would necessarily need to take into account how these different components are made of. What are the properties of the main components? The main components usually are, on the one hand, the input, the function, and then the output. The input is the condition of eligibility, usually. The function is a procedure, and the output would be, for example, the reward type. Obviously, we could add different layers to this. So, for example, we could also talk about the representation of the reward mechanism as well. This could also be part of the reward mechanism. So, depending on the level of abstraction that you're going to take, it could become a little bit bigger, or it could have a lower amount of components. Could have more components or less components. Now, these are the three structural elements that I would suggest are necessary in any in any possible analysis of reward mechanisms. Without these three components, it's hard to talk about a mechanism at all. Let's give some examples. I will focus specifically on the first two different components, so the input and the function here. So input, for example, ratio reward mechanisms. What are ratio reward mechanisms? Ratio reward mechanisms, here we are talking about the eligibility condition. These are rewards mechanisms that it's the idea of giving a reward when a task is performed. So the condition of eligibility here is performing a task. A user performing a task is what is going to trigger the reward mechanism. This is an example from the good old game Metal Slug. If you complete a mission, when you complete a mission, you will go to the next level. When you complete a task, you will get rewarded. And this is a fixed ratio reward mechanism. But this is not the only type of reward mechanism, or this is not the only kind of condition of eligibility that there is there. Another type of eligibility condition is that of that one based on time, so temporal reward mechanisms. Reward mechanisms that are not selecting, that are not giving a reward based on whether a task is performed or not, but whether a certain amount of time has passed or not. So very often in mobile video games, in free-to-play video games specifically, you could see that there are daily rewards, for example. So each day you will get a reward, or rewards based on time. So when a certain amount of time, 5 minutes, an hour, a week has passed, you get a reward. Now, the other layer would be the function, the procedure. And one is randomness, for example. So the procedure is randomness here. The function rewards at a random rate. And you could combine ratio, so the conditional eligibility that we saw at the very beginning, the idea of performing a task. You are rewarded when you perform a task, but randomly in this case. And you have slot machines, could be, or this is a game called Coin Master, and it is a good example. There are different categories, subcategories, of course, that you could trace here. These are just a few examples. But then you could also place randomness, a random function, to a reward that has as a trigger condition time. So you could reward randomly, but based on time. Events, very often random events, to me appear to be random rewards, but that are temporal. So we can see here how combining different layers and different variables could produce new types, new categories of rewards mechanisms. Now, the second big piece of the puzzle that I see is necessary to be discussed when we talk about reward mechanisms is the relationship between different reward mechanisms. And here it gets a little bit trickier, but I would say that there are two ways of seeing these connections, these relationships. One is looking at them vertically. This is tricky. I know that it's counterintuitive, but let me explain this. This is the idea that you have to look at reward mechanism, for example, produced by developers, designed by developers, in the context that those developers also are working, also are developing under specific incentives and reward mechanisms that often are set. For example, if we are in a private companies, those incentives might be set by the board of directors. And the incentives that are moving the board of directors and their decisions might be set by shareholders. So it's the idea that we could look at this chain. This is a more sociological maybe approach. We might start to look at these different chains and connections. So the context within which a specific reward mechanism is produced or selected might have, we need to look at these conditions in order to understand why a group of people has determined or has selected a specific type of reward mechanism. Otherwise, if we just blame, for example, or if we just consider the development team, we would probably miss the whole picture, the broader picture. This is one just possible ways, of course, of looking at reward mechanisms. I'm not saying that this is the best way or a necessary way. I do believe that this type of sociological approach, but also look at power relationships, could be useful, generally speaking. So this is the idea that developers operate within organizations and their choices reflect the incentives of those organizations. So it's a chain of incentives, let's say, that ultimately, of course, is reflected into reward mechanisms that are present in a piece of software or in a digital environment or in a game. Now, the other way of looking at the relationships of reward mechanisms is to look at them horizontally. So the idea that reward mechanisms are often bundled together and are codependent. So very often we could have technically speaking, a very good taxonomy and look at one reward mechanism and categorize it very well, but we would miss the broader picture if we don't look at how that specific reward mechanism is connected to the other ones that are present in a digital environment. Again, this is an example from CoinMaster. We could see that multiple types of mechanisms, multiple types of reward mechanisms are connected one to the other one, and they produce something different. So depending on the level of abstraction that you're taking, of course, you could consider them as one global reward mechanism, but at the more granular level, you necessarily have to look at how these individually work and how they are connected one to the other one. Again, these are all suggestions of how we could, I think, look at reward mechanisms. These are not just prescriptive ways. I'm not telling you that this is the best way to do this, but I think this could be helpful in the future. Again, this is something I just said. The complexity of depends on the level of abstraction that you're taking. Last, and I'm reaching the end. So another possible piece of puzzle, another possible a way of looking at reward mechanisms is to focus a little bit more on the goals, I think, of reward mechanisms. So very often reward mechanisms are implemented, or usually they are implemented to make users achieve a goal, right? To steer the behavior of users so that they will achieve a common goal, a goal that usually is the goal that is hoped, is assumed by the developers. Now, the issue sometimes is that larger goals often have to be translated by using proxies. And let me give you an example. This actually is an example. I'm not sure 100% whether it's correct or not, so correct me if I'm wrong. But last time when I participated to the seminar, you talked about different apps that you're building right now, that you're developing, and one of them was Greenathon. And something that I thought was very interesting about it was the idea of empowering communities to solve problems related to climate change. Now, this would be the goal, right? The goal of the app, the goal of the piece of software, of that specific environment, of that specific technology would be to empower communities. The question would be, well, how do you evaluate empowerment? So how do you translate empowerment into implement empowerment or move people towards empowerment? How do you evaluate it? You need probably to translate it into by using a proxy, something that becomes valuable, that is possible to evaluate, numerically speaking. Now, if I'm wrong here, correct me later on. Probably I'm wrong, but I hope I'm making a point that's understandable. Let me give you a different example that's more clear, maybe that of YouTube. YouTube has produced its reward mechanism, which is often considered a recommender system. So depending on the way you're looking at it, you could claim that it is a recommender system or that it is a reward mechanism that's rewarding videos. And the whole idea of YouTube in 2012, when they started building their more recent recommender system, was to reward videos based on the satisfaction of users, of the end users. The problem is that evaluating satisfaction was not straightforward. There's no number. There's no straightforward way to evaluate what satisfaction is. So they needed to use a proxy. And what did they do? Well, they used watch time as a proxy for satisfaction. So instead of directly evaluating, directly seeing what is the satisfaction level of users, which would be extremely complicated at a very large scale, they started checking watch time, and they started rewarding videos based on the watch time, so on the time spent by end users. The more time users were spending watching videos, the better the video was considered by the algorithm. So therefore, satisfaction was considered in that specific case as very high for a specific video. So watch time became the proxy, which partially distorted. Okay, this is an example that comes from my fieldwork. What happened with that is that more and more people started making longer and longer videos. Now, this is a strange example that comes from my fieldwork. I went to Bangkok. This is a weird story. Anyway, I went to Bangkok because I was doing participant observation for a multi-channel network, so a company making videos, for profit videos to upload on YouTube. And they asked me explicitly to imitate a different video, but to make it longer. The only reason they asked me to make it longer was that they knew that by making the video longer, even though the content was pretty much the same, that video would have more chances to be rewarded highly by the system, by YouTube. So this, to a certain degree, produced some form of distortion within YouTube that on the long term has diminish the originality very often of YouTube videos, but also has created a distorted system where creators are incentivized to make longer videos without considering other possible variables or other possible metrics to determine whether their video is good or not. View time, watch time became the dominant and the predominant goal. So what happens here, and here I'm reaching the real conclusion, is that sometimes, and this is the case of YouTube, individual and collective behavior that are trying to meet the normative standards that emerge within a platform because of the reward mechanisms that are adopted might go against individual and social interest. So what happened with YouTube is that longer and longer videos, yes, became predominant and more popular, but those videos were not necessarily what people were looking for. So here I'm going to conclude. To repeat, reward mechanisms set contextual goals and norms, and from that point of view, they are ethical devices. The issue is that sometimes these goals and norms might clash with social norms. So unfortunately, no good categories to describe reward mechanisms exist right now. There has been a lot of focus on random reward mechanisms, for example, over the last few years. However, other variables, other possible dimensions to examine reward mechanisms in digital environments have not been, I would say, scrutinized that much. I do believe that taxonomy of reward mechanisms is needed. The question would be what kind of taxonomy? So after all I've said, and after all these different aspects that I have examined and I try to show to you, the question remains, well, should we take all of the things that I said into consideration? Or maybe there are other aspects of reward mechanisms that are more important than what I discussed today. So what should we take into account if we want to build a taxonomy, and how to do it? Should we try to develop it by adopting a more deductive type of analysis, or should it be a more inductive type of definition, the one that we should look forward to? And this is pretty much the end. So thank you very much for listening to this relatively weird presentation, I think, for all of you. I'm pretty sure you're not used to have such a speculative and absolutely detached from any real research type of analysis, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was not too boring. And maybe I hope to have helped you to think about it in the future. Thanks so much.